Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're very glad you're joining us again today. We are on location in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we are seated with the author of this book, David Berceli, Trauma Releasing Exercises. David is a clinical social worker, a bioenergetics therapist, a massage therapist. He has taken tools that he has amassed over the course of decades to develop a trauma-releasing technique. David has worked in war-torn countries across the world, working with emotional, physical conflict and trauma, helping people get through and deal with the shocks, the difficulties of war, its aftermath, and the like. He has been a missionary for Mary Knoll Sisters in such places as Beirut, and he's been in the Sudan. He's been literally all over the world working with people who are considered victims of war and the greatest of difficulties. He's also working with the military currently, dealing with the what's coming out of Iraq, with the problems and physical and emotional trauma and difficulties of our soldiers. His work is rather astounding, and in this interview you will get to learn more about it. Hi, David.
Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you.
Good to be with you.
Thanks.
I'm so glad to have you. It's so few people who are doing this level of work, and it's just so moving to hear some of the stories of what's going on. How is it that you got into this in the very first place?
Well, initially I was working as a Catholic missionary with Mary Knoll, and I was with the Mary Knoll brothers and fathers, and I was sent to the Middle East to do work there. While I was there, I was living in Beirut, and this is at a time when Beirut was in tremendous violence and there was a lot of fighting, and basically it was in the middle of civil war.
In what years were those?
This was in the late 70s, actually. And essentially what happened was, although I was working with refugees of war, I myself was being traumatized. And when I came back to the United States, I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, but it wasn't commonly understood or known what that was. So I was fairly on my own to try to figure out how to deal with and heal this problem that I was experiencing. And in my therapeutic process, the only thing I knew how to do was go to counseling, which I did for 2 years. And at the end of the counseling process, I still realized I was still suffering very severely from PTSD, but it seemed to be something more in my body than it was in my psyche. And that's what got me on the journey of trying to explore what is post-traumatic stress disorder and how does it really affect us as human beings, and how does it affect the psyche and the body differently, and maybe what are the two different healing processes that need to occur for complete resolution of the trauma recovery.
That really does highlight a very important point, which is that psychological inquiry and even understanding and awareness, all of which have its place and has some effect on neuromusculature and memory,
right,
and release of trauma and emotional conflict and tension.
Yeah.
But I'm really gathering that it's only up to a certain point.
Right, right.
After which the body itself really needs to be engaged directly.
Right.
That's what you found, obviously.
Basically, what we're looking at is that although humans, we're living in an organism, and this organism, when it's endangered, has certain reactions that it does instinctually, and they're not cognitively designed. We're not thinking
mediated.
They're not mediated that way. So we don't think of our responses in trauma. We just organically and instinctually respond to them much as animals would do. Well, that instinctual response has to be dealt with as much as a cognitive response to the trauma.
So what happened? Is that when you met and studied with Al Lowen at this point? Or?
Well, that was part of the
Al
process.
Lowen, the founder of bioenergetics, of course, where you were studying with him and his wife exercise classes and the like every day,
Yes.
Like military training.
Exactly, it was sort of like that. Leslie Lowen did these amazing workshops and a lot of heavy-duty body work, but all it was doing was focusing on that the body has some memory and some contractions that are still held in it, even though I cognitively understood the trauma. Residually, my body was still holding on to the trauma as a defensive behavior. And body therapy was the modality that I needed to use to complete the healing process. Bioenergetics happened to be the modality at the time that I was using, but I used things like Tai Chi and yoga and other things, just that they took too long, and I also wouldn't have been able to use those modalities in other countries because I was going to return back to the Middle East again.
Oh, bioenergetics, I think, was an excellent choice that carries a lot of the wisdom of the East.
Right.
And the Reichian therapy, of course, at base.
Right.
And a psychological understanding as well. So
right, exactly. So it was
good place.
putting those two together and then trying to figure out how do I take specific parts of the bioenergetic principles and apply them cross-culturally, taking them out of a psychotherapeutic dynamics because that couldn't be applied in other cultural contexts, and particularly if I didn't know the language. So I needed a modality that I could use very quickly, and it would be cross-cultural in its effects because I worked with large populations of traumatized people. I had to focus on purely a body-based method that could do a couple of things. I could teach it to large populations because I saw hundreds of traumatized people at a time. I didn't see just one or two in my office. You go to southern Sudan, or you go to Lebanon, or you go to Israel, or the Palestinian West Bank, you're seeing thousands of traumatized people. Well, if the only paradigm we have is that those people have to heal by going to 2 years of individual psychotherapy, we basically destine them to never heal from their trauma. And that's just unacceptable. So with mass trauma that we see today, even in something like 9/11 or Katrina, hurricane, we have to say our paradigm has to shift, and we have to find modalities that can be used with thousands of people at a time, and a body-based modality that can be simply taught and simply practiced even after the therapist leaves the trauma zone is what I'm trying to design here.
Absolutely. So who have you worked with? What groups of people?
Well, I've worked in lots of countries. I've worked with Ethiopians and Eritreans. I've worked with Ugandans, Tanzanians, Kenyans, Sudanese, Palestinians, Israelis, Lebanese, Syrians. All of the crowds of people in North Africa and the Middle East that are being constantly traumatized by political conflict or war. And I try
Civil war, external invasion.
So I try to constantly work with both sides of those parties, knowing that unless you heal the trauma from both dimensions, it will continue to perpetuate itself.
And from both sides.
From both sides, exactly.
So in a sense, what you're really doing, you're by helping people come to peace themselves, you're actually a peacemaker.
Right, exactly.
It's where peace lives, not on a piece of paper.
Right. What I've
internally.
discovered is I was hired to do a lot of conflict resolution, and what I discovered is there's no such thing as resolving conflict by negotiating process if you're not dealing with the undermining principles of the anger, resentment, hurt, and pain that trauma
underlying or undermining.
Both
That's
of them,
interesting.
exactly.
Yeah. Right.
That's still very active in the individual. So how could I really negotiate with you at some peaceful level when right within the soma of my body is a defensive behavior that's preventing me from ever getting close to you because I still don't trust you. And that is not necessarily cognitive or conscious in me.
I am so happy to have met you. I'm serious. This is so beautiful because you're articulating things that I have been talking about for so long. You can't make peace at a table if the anger under the surface is seething.
Exactly.
You can smile and shake hands and have photo ops, but it's completely meaningless.
Right, and that's why we see a lot of the peace negotiations continue to fall apart because there's still bitterness and hurt and rage and anger that's right under the surface, and so a negotiated peace contract is really fabricated. It can't last because something else will initiate, again, the hatred or the resentment or the fear usually that causes the whole negotiating process to fall apart.
Exactly. So what have you seen, on the ground, so to speak, David? What have you seen happen as a result of the work that you have done with people?
Well, what I do is that I take large groups of people, 150, 200 people at a time.
At a time.
Because if you imagine that I go to Sudan when Sudan was at war between the North and the South. Now they have peace and it's somewhat
Semi-peace.
Semi-peace. But anyways, I would go to a whole population of people, and there'd be 200 people, all of them severely traumatized. And the problem was, well, how do you deal with 200 traumatized people in a population? So I designed a method that they could actually follow me to do some exercises that release what are commonly known now as neurogenic tremors, meaning that tremoring that you get when you're scared or when you get nervous or frightened, that tremor, instead of treating it pathologically, I actually deliberately evoke the tremors in the body because they begin to release the terror or the anxiety or the hurt or fear that's in the person's body. And as that releases, they literally can feel their organism or their body just letting go, almost like melting away of the trauma behaviors that have embedded themselves in the musculature of the body.
So interesting. So Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard has taken on a new life.
Right, exactly, exactly. Well, what's happening now in science is we're beginning to recognize that human animals do have instinctual responses just like other mammals in the wild. And if you see a mammal in the wild, an animal, a gazelle, being chased by a tiger, if it escapes that tiger unscathed, after it's done, it basically just shivers and shakes. And what it does is literally shakes itself out of trauma, and then it just moves on. That's why animals don't get post-traumatic stress disorder. They don't hold on to it. And we do the exact opposite. When we begin to shiver or tremor, we assume it's pathological, and we in some way try to stop the tremoring. And the minute you stop it, you prevent the human animal from having its natural instinctual discharge of the high hyper-aroused behavior that comes from trauma, and then we end up carrying it through the rest of our life, which is what gives rise to post-trauma symptoms.
Exactly. If it's not shaken out, in other words,
right,
it's retained,
exactly,
embedded
right
in the musculature, remains there, and becomes essentially suppressed and then later repressed.
Right, and then that's what creates the cycle of repeated violence, because the organism is still trying to get to completion what it wasn't able to complete because it couldn't shake.
Exactly.
And so
it would also come out in dreams. Because
precisely,
what it is it's energy. It's closeted energy
right, exactly,
that needs
right.
release, and it will come out.
Right, and that energetic discharge, when it doesn't reach completion, continues this cycle or this loop of trying to keep reaching completion. So you actually reenact trauma as a way of bringing a discharge to the high emotional charge in the body. And so people are destined then to continue to repeat traumatic events as a way of re-stimulating themselves in the hopes of finally coming to a complete discharge.
Yes. This is really also aligned with a fairly standard psychotherapeutic and psychoanalytic model
Absolutely.
Of repeating what has not been completed.
Exactly right.
You know, you will find that, of course, in Freud. You will find it, of course, in Jung, and even more modern psychotherapeutic attitudes and perspectives.
The only thing
it's just that you're bringing the undergirding, if you will, the actual soma into the picture where it belonged all along.
Exactly
and,
right.
you know, Freud recognized that to some extent. Of course, Reich took it to its more appropriate level.
Right. And the only thing I did with trauma releasing exercises was I just focused on the human animal to ask what muscles get contracted during the traumatic event, very deep inside the core of the body. And if I can release that same core, can the body go from a contracted state of trauma into a relaxed state of openness? That's the only thing. So I really focused on just those core muscles and then designed 7 exercises that specifically target that core. And once they target it, the body organically tremors by itself. And that tremoring follows the pathway of the contraction through the body and simply discharges it organically. They don't need a counselor or a therapist present. They can do it by themselves, and they only have to learn it once, and they can repeat it constantly, so that when I go to Sudan, and I go there over years at a time, each time I go back, they're already doing their trauma recovery work. They've been doing it for the 3 months I was gone.
So interesting.
And it's very simple for them to simply keep repeating the pattern after every trauma so it doesn't re-embed itself back in the muscle tissue of the body.
But once it's released, it is released.
Yes, it's released, but if you have a subsequent trauma, then the body
Oh.
contracts all over again,
I see.
and you have to discharge it again. But once that's discharged, it no longer exists in the musculature. There's nothing to go back to, or nothing residual, or nothing you have to keep going for. It's just gone. See, and the body just sort of unfolds itself back up to normal, and you can move on with life, much the same as animals. So I was working with an individual, and I never know the story of the person in terms of what their history is. So I'm just working purely with the bodily structure. So this individual is doing the work, and he's getting very mild tremors in his legs and in his pelvis, and that was fine. But I could see that his body type, the muscle tone was very deeply and tightly contracted. Well, that already tells me there's some history of something that created such a tight contraction in the body. It just doesn't do that for no reason and by itself. So there's a history there. And so I just watch the body and let the history unfold. And so as this person is laying there and tremoring, it's the first time he had ever felt these tremors, and he felt them to be an amazing release, although the tremors were not very powerful, but they were in fact going deep within the core of his body, and he loved this release.
Now you described this fellow as kind of a tight, tough, aggressive, kind of macho
Right, he was
type
sort
of guy
a
who
typical
you
sort
would
of
not
guy.
think would show up necessarily in a workshop
Exactly
like this.
right. And just by his demeanor, he was demonstrating that he's had a tough life and he's a pretty rugged guy. And that's sort of how he presents himself, and that's the way he came to the workshop. So he does the work, has this amazing experience for himself, and the next day he comes back to me to tell me this amazing, powerful experience he had and how relaxed he was in his body and how powerful this was for him, how excited he was by it. So I was really pleased with that. So we again, in the second day of the workshop, we did the same exercises. As he's laying
That's
there...
quite a report from such a guy as that.
Oh, absolutely. It was quite a surprise, actually, because I didn't expect him to really either feel like he'd gotten much out of it, and certainly not come back and give me very deliberate feedback of how important and powerful this was for his body. The next day he comes back, we do the exercises a second time, and while he's laying on the floor and he's again shaking, and I went and said to him, "What's happening in your body?" And he said, "Well, I think the shaking is a little bit stronger than yesterday." And I said, "Okay, it looks like that to me too." So I said, "Stay there," and what I asked him to do was just make a little bit of sound, to let some sound come up through his throat, because he was getting a lot of shaking in his legs and his pelvis, but it wasn't moving anywhere. So I sort of put my hand underneath his neck just to hold his neck as he made some sound. And his neck turned extremely deep red, and I could see that he was contracting against some sort of sound. So I said to him, "Go ahead, let the sound come, let the sound come." And he finally said to me, "I can't, because my father will beat me if I make any noise." And what happened is as he said that, his whole pelvis shook violently with this huge release of energy that was actually stuck in it. You could literally see from this very refined shaking to this very violent tremoring going on in the pelvic girdle, and out comes this tremendous crying and sobbing, and there the whole body just begins to ripple with this amazing aliveness that before was this tight contraction that couldn't move at all, and now all of a sudden he pulls together what his story is in his body, and the whole organism of the body just pulsated with that story. Right in front of me, I saw his life history being revealed by the body's movement. And it was profoundly powerful.
Can you say what it is? What happened?
Well,
some extent?
it's just tremendous abuse from very early childhood between he and his father, and probably other people in his early childhood. And I don't want to reveal too much about it, but it was, in fact, from early childhood, very deep, severe abuse, which means he literally needed to protect himself from his whole childhood on. And that's what was just unfolding right there. In just the second session, all of his childhood from very deep early abuse just started to relax and let go, and the whole body tremored with that new awakening in him. So that's one example of if you work with the organism,
So the story
it unfolds.
is locked in the body.
Yeah.
Specifically, it's locked in the musculature.
Right.
It's also, by the way, locked in the organs.
Right.
It is
Oh,
there.
absolutely.
It
The
can't
smooth
be in one
muscles as
place.
well.
Yes, exactly. However, it's primarily in the pelvic area.
Right.
Which is also related to, the root chakra and the area that we deal with in the martial arts.
Right, right.
The dantian, the hara in
Right.
Japanese.
One of the core reasons for going here to start unfolding
place of the life
trauma,
force. The place of the
life force, is anatomically, it's also the center of gravity of the body.
Absolutely.
So just for this human organism to understand how to stand and move through space, it has to be able to identify where the center of gravity is. And the psoas muscles that protect that and cause this motion inward when you're protecting
contraction.
life, that contraction, those psoas muscles are the beginning of the place of unfolding for the organism as well. If I wanted to come upright like this, the psoas muscles have to now release and let the body unfold. So I actually work towards the psoas muscles for the initial release so that all the secondary contraction along the spinal column actually occurs naturally once the psoas muscles let go.
So in the workshops that you do in this country and across the world, you witness things such as the story being told through the body and the release. How about with women who are raped?
That again is the same problem. If the body's contraction naturally during danger is to pull forward, and the rapist is pushing the body backwards, you can have a lot of tearing in the psoas muscles that even when you're doing a gynecological exam, obviously, you're not going to see that tearing. And I have many clients, rape victims, who say to me, I still hurt, but no one can clinically find anything wrong with me. And they're right about that. The psoas muscles are mildly torn because they're muscles just like the biceps that you can tear if you do a barbell that's too heavy for you. Well, if I'm contracting this way naturally and I'm being pushed backwards this way, it's obviously going to cause tearing in the musculature. And so then there's a lot of tightness in there. And for the rest of their life, unless they go through some therapeutic process that relaxes the psoas muscles, they're constantly responding and contracting against the tearing and the scarring that could be in the tissues of the psoas muscle.
You told me a story that I would love to bring to the audience. It's so moving, of an experience you had under the sky in the Sudan.
Okay.
And I say this because its implications are rather far-reaching, and I think this audience would appreciate the connectedness of the work you're doing to kind of a deeper spiritual, if you will, cosmic rhythm that we're all connected to, and understanding biological cycles on one hand, understanding biorhythms, understanding some of the teachings of the Native American indigenous peoples.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't really steeped in a lot of these different traditions.
That makes it all the more interesting.
Right. What really happened to me, which helped me understand things at a deeper level, was that I was going to a number of different countries sort of rapidly. Every 3 months or so, I was moving to a new war country. So I was constantly being shown hundreds of thousands of traumatized people, huge populations of trauma, and it was in different pockets around the world. So I was constantly seeing this, and it was like going over and over in my mind. And one time when I was in southern Sudan, and I was in an extremely remote area of Sudan, giving workshops over a 2 or 3 week period, what happened was, one night I was laying out on a mattress out under the stars, and I was very quiet, it was very still, and I was laying there in this silence, and I began to feel this pulsation that was going on, and I thought it was my blood pressure. So as I laid there a little bit longer, I realized it wasn't my blood pressure because it wasn't pulsating at the same vibratory rate. And what I really felt was happening was that I actually sensed the pulsation of the planet. It was like this profound, rhythmic, deep vibratory rate that somehow my body could sense because of the stillness that was there. And in this pulsation, all I kept doing was wondering, what is it saying to me? What is it saying? And it was a profound moment for me. But at that moment, I realized what happened was the planet itself was pulsating through me to get the awareness somatically that we vibrate at a resonance, and that this whole method that I'm teaching is nothing about bringing the body back to its natural vibratory rhythm, and that is what restores it back to being in touch with the planet and ultimately safety.
What a revelation.
Yeah, it was a very profound
powerful
experience for me.
Yeah, exactly.
And since then, I've been
in the
compelled
depths
to do
of
the work.
Africa.
Right, exactly. You can
and
make it all that sort of mystical sort of thing, but it's profoundly, deeply...
Well, it's primordial is what it is.
Primordial, right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Oh, and that even furthered your own commitment
Exactly
to continuing
right.
this
then
work.
Something about, I knew this was right.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So interesting. It's also interesting that you had no particular leaning in that direction to even think about such things, but organically, it's like the planet spoke to you,
right, and presented
in its way,
itself. Exactly
through rhythm,
right.
through
Yes.
rhythm,
right,
you know,
right.
And that also makes a case for the importance of dance in our lives.
Right.
You know, it's
So
not like
many
just
things.
it's fun. It's fun, sure, but there's this underlying, undergirding reason of release.
Exactly right. And then, of course, all the cultures I was in, I began to see that vibration trying to express itself in many different forms.
Exactly, and the role of percussion as well.
Exactly,
I mean,
right,
yeah, so-
right, and the drumming and all that stuff.
Exactly. God, David, it is a very beautiful work, and I just encourage you to continue on because
Thanks a lot.
it's so fundamental. I feel like it really has the potential for great peacekeeping and peacemaking in this planet, in this world.
Yeah,
I really
thank
do.
you so
And
much.
it's because
I
it's really
appreciate it.
getting to the core, so to speak.
Yeah.
So bless you and your work.
Okay, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Really a pleasure, David.
Okay,
Really
take
a
care.
pleasure. Wow. Well, I hope you all go home and shake according to David's teachings. It's be very worthwhile. In fact, if we all do this in reality, I think we'll have healthier and happier relations everywhere. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks so much for joining us. Here we are in Scottsdale, Arizona, on location, speaking with David Berceli. Again, thanks for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next week.